Okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here at the Haifa University. Um, this session is going to discuss education and anti-Semitism, how it affects each other, how education can actually, hopefully make anti-Semitism not be so bad, but also, how does anti-Semitism manifest or uh, you know, appear in higher education. So before we start, Dr. Zohar Raviv from Birthright, who's really the educational brain behind everything going on in Birthright for the past many years. We're going to hear from Lily Minkoff, sitting next to me. She studies at Emerson, sorry. And she is on Birthright Onward. And she has a number of examples to share with us about what it's like to be, in university today. I'll say, Zora and I are not the same age, but we're a lot older than you are. And when you speak about higher education and anti-Semitism there, so we're not necessarily the age bracket of the students. And we also don't speak Gen Z language, so we'll try and understand.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I've just finished my first 2 years of undergrad. I don't think I'm going to go further than 4 years, but I thought it would be best to try to give an example of what academia is currently like for Jewish students, especially at more of a left-leaning school. I entered Emerson at the fall of 2024. What happened with the encampments, at least in the United States, was actually a huge part of my decision making. It was between Emerson and Brandeis, very Jewish of me. And what was really interesting is going in, fall of 2024 was still the war. It hadn't been a year since October 7th, and I've already felt not necessarily like explicit Jew hate, but very much that anti-Zionism, that neo-Soviet hatred. For example, I have my two main examples are in fall 2024, and they're two end of semester projects. The first one is for my macroeconomics class, which I took. So the final project was basically write about what you want, just make sure it covers something. And I thought, oh, I can talk about geopolitics and relating it back to economies of a specific country. And my main example was how once the Soviet Union fell, Israeli unemployment shot up. And it's not because anything happened in Israel, it's because over 1 million Jews entered the country at once and they couldn't find jobs right away. But this was also fall of 2024, and I knew some people wouldn't be kind if I just said Israel exists. So I put a disclaimer being like, hey, I mentioned Israel, this has nothing to do with the conflict, please don't be racist. And my anonymous peer review said, oh my God, thank you so much for the disclaimer. I went into this with a much more open mind. And I'm like, why would I need to give a disclaimer when mentioning a country? Got an A on the paper.
But by the way, just to ask, so would you put that disclaimer again if you were to write it? Because you don't have to.
I would, because I don't trust my peers to be normal when talking about Israel. Even though I didn't mention the conflict, I just said Israel's a country that exists, and it's my main example because I talk about immigration and unemployment. It has everything to do with what we discussed in the macroeconomics class, but I don't trust Gen Zers, at least in higher academia, with being normal about Israel.
Okay. That's very positive. And you said you had another example.
The other example is based off of how I thought of the encampments. And I saw a lot of things in the spring of 2024 being like, student leaders are on the right side of history. And this was mainly said through American students, and they were emulating stuff like the Vietnam War and the unfortunate massacre at Kent State. But my thoughts on student activism is some of the most impactful things students have done was the Iranian hostage crisis of the 1979 and the Red Guards in Maoist China. So for one of my intro classes that fall of 2024, I did a project being like, how successful, like, do student activists know the history of their student activism? So I asked, and the anonymous poll basically being like, hey, what are the most name something impactful that student activists have done. And a lot of the demographics, like 18 to 25, they were like Vietnam, like around, or civil rights. Someone mentioned, I forget the name of it, but the case of the students during the Vietnam War who went to Supreme Court for protesting with the armbands. And no one said anything about how college students in Iran held 50 Americans hostage for 444 days, which I thought was very telling considering the encampments, especially in places like Colombia, held a janitor hostage. And I feel like there's a lack of knowledge. I'm not sure if it's a willing lack, it's a whole jumble of things, but as a Gen Z college student, I feel like there is a lack of knowledge about the conflict, Israel, Judaism in academia, and it's not helping that like professors, when talking about multiculturalism, don't mention Jews. I took a literature class about like American voices in literature in fall 2025, and there were no Jews, even though I'm like, Emma Lazarus is one of the coolest poets in the 19th century. Why don't we talk about her? And we're like, no, we're gonna talk about Marx. Even though he's not American, it doesn't have anything to do with this class. You're gonna read Marx. I'm like, okay. So that's my experience, at least in
This is
Boston
America at
education.
250.
Yippee!
Okay. So Lily, thank you for that. And I think at the end we'll open it up for questions, and you can come back and I'm sure a lot of people have questions to ask you about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Zohar, Dr. Zohar Raviv, how are you?
Hi, Zvika.
How you doing? After that positive,
Considering the topic of the discussion, I could do better.
okay, fine. So this conference talks about, anti-Semitism. I'll start with a personal note. So 11 years ago, I did a video walking the streets of Paris with a kippah on and a hidden camera, and we wanted to see how people would react to an Orthodox Jew walking around Paris with a white kippah on my head. So I still had hair, so you needed the contrast there. And it tzitzit out, the fringes, and I was spat at, cursed, threatened to leave certain areas. And one of the things that it wasn't caught on tape, but one of these kids, I walked by, and it was a very Muslim neighborhood, said, what is this Jew doing here? Doesn't he know he's going to be killed? Like this is not a place for Jews to walk around. And then there were those that said, oh, why do you go to a Muslim neighborhood? But there are no walls or fences between the neighborhoods, right? It should be, if it's a democracy, every place should be open for any type of citizen. But that kid, right, this is 11 years ago, he could probably be towards the end of high school. Now, what does he know about Jews, right? Probably, they were speaking in Arabic, so it probably wasn't positive, because it's very difficult to learn about Israel in Arabic in a positive way or a non-negative way. So today, we had a long discussion about this panel. There's, I think, two topics that you raised. One of which we could start, as Rabbi Sachs says, and maybe many other people say, and Rabbi Sachs is probably in every other panel over here, that it never, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews, and racism is racism, and it could start with Jews and end with other ethnicities or groups. So how do you see, how are we doing, first of all, with combating anti-Semitism?
Okay, so I've been involved with Jewish education for the better part of 30 years, half of it by leading the educational philosophy, pedagogy, and language of Birthright Israel, as you know, Zvika. And I think that, and that's the reason we offered this panel today, we cannot just speak about anti-Semitism in the abstract, but rather we need to brush it against the phenomenology of Jewish life in the 21st century, and then try to chart a more of a comprehensive roadmap towards addressing anti-Semitism. And I'm using the word addressing anti-Semitism because it is broader than just fighting against anti-Semitism. So first of all, I want to make a very important distinction, which lends itself to the title of this panel. I believe that there are two types of addressing anti-Semitism when we look at institutional structures. The first is institutions whose raison d'etre is to fight anti-Semitism or to bring it to the surface. For example, the Anti-Defamation League, okay? Whose main purpose is, among other things, to fight anti-Semitism.
But also to document, I would say.
To document it, to educate about it, to expose it, and to fight against it. My main thesis here as an educator is that in educational institutions, fighting anti-Semitism should never be a goal, but rather an outcome. And what do I mean by that? I can tell you that in my position, I travel all over the world. The number one item on the agenda of the global Jewish community right now is fighting anti-Semitism, quote unquote. And one of the claims that I bring forward on behalf also of Birthright Israel, but also as part of a larger philosophy, is that if Birthright Israel, for example, as a leading organization, and other educational venues invest, and I'm looking at it from the Jewish perspective, invest in educational processes that yield well-informed, intelligent, well-contextualized, critically thinking Jews, one of the outcome of such a process will be that they will now stand against anti-Semites because they are internally motivated to do so rather than externally instructed to do so.
But if a Birthright group comes to Israel now, right, hopefully with the skies
we
open.
have thousands of them. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So is there any session that speaks about anti-Semitism? Because it's, it's all about Judaism and it's about learning about your homeland. When I was a madrich on Birthright 20 years ago, 20-something years ago, it was a very different situation. Right?
Absolutely. And so the answer to your question, which lends itself to my philosophy, there is no exclusive session about fighting anti-Semitism because I will not, that's not there. There is a session about the condition of Jews in the 21st century, which also addresses anti-Semitism. Here, I actually want to tap into one of the things Lily said, because it's important that we understand in the academic climate that most Jewish, and by the way, non-Jewish students on campuses worldwide harbor no anti-Semitic feelings, have nothing to say in favor or against Zionism or Israel. The majority,
the silent majority,
yeah. That includes the Jewish students. However, from a Jewish perspective, when I look and I scope hundreds of universities, and we receive participants from hundreds of universities worldwide, I can tell you that the average, if we can use that term, Jewish student constitutes what I call a silent majority among the Jewish students themselves. In other words, people who don't want to open it up, speak about it, explore it, because the environment around them is not permitting that. They're a silent majority, but it is a silent majority that feels as a silenced minority.
So they're aware of the situation. It's not something that they don't think about.
Absolutely, they're aware, and that's why I think that.
Well, Lily, for instance, silenced herself in a way.
Yeah,
in a way,
she was
braver than others.
Yeah, she's on the proactive end of that pool.
Yeah.
Most students are not there.
No,
which makes Lily exceptional in this case. But I think that from an educational standpoint, and that's something that is important for us to understand. The main problem regarding anti-Semitism, Israel, Zionism, is not necessarily the content of the conversation or the exchange of opinions about said subject matter, but rather the inability to hold a conversation to begin with.
Now, so my job is to stop you every once in a while and ask the question, and I'm going to do it. So I actually met with, under your recommendation, etc. I met with I think 2 or 3 birthright groups since October 7th.
Right.
And spoke to them about Jewish peoplehood, but like I never like to just speak. I want to hear what they have to say, as well as the Israelis. It was about them and the Israelis getting to know each other. What I noticed, and again, this is 2 groups out of dozens or hundreds. They were more on the progressive side.
Mm-hmm.
One of the groups was from the Bay Area, San Francisco, etc. From all the schools we read about all the time, or we write about all the time, with terrible things happening towards Israel, towards Jews. So, is the type of young adults that are coming on Birthright different?
That's a very, very good question, and I want to look at it from a tactical and a strategic standpoint. From a tactical standpoint, we definitely realized that the type of student that arrives on Birthright Israel trips since October 7th are students who have a more robust Jewish identity, a more self-assured Jewish identity, and a greater level of curiosity and proactive.
Because the ones I met were
like
but the ones I met were not. It was their first time in Israel. Some of them were forced into
their Jewish
into their Jewish identity
stunned
because
back into
because of October, whatever happened afterwards. Part of the Black Lives Matter movement,
Right.
and all and those types of organizations. But then after October 7th, being distanced by all of their allies and friends. So are we seeing more of those? Or because also, we're still in a war zone, so you can understand if those don't come.
Well, first of all, the majority of those who come now, the thousands who do arrive, do not necessarily subscribe by the characteristics you just outlined.
Mhm.
Many of them still opt to shy away or wait. But there's another thing that you should realize, is that when we research this and try to understand what are the reasons behind not coming, we figured that not to a small extent, many a time, the people who stop participants from coming are not the participants themselves, but their parents.
Mhm.
So we're not only talking about
Or
us versus a single
Or their countries, by the
or,
way.
or in
Sometimes
some-
it's
in some cases it becomes-
insurance or advisory not to,
Yeah. So we have it's a multi-layered ordeal. However, and that's the important thing about our discussion today. I want to share with you that my major concern as an educator is the distinction that we need to make between understanding and addressing anti-Semitism as part of our educational platform, which is absolutely important, just as it is important to address tragedies that have befallen our people throughout history, including the modern era. But there's a huge difference between doing that and turning those tragedies, including anti-Semitism, into the founding blocks of Jewish identity formation. And that line may be fine for some, but it is profoundly important from an educational perspective. Jewish identity should not be based on the way Jews perceive their adversaries seeing them, but rather should be based on the inner mechanisms of Jewish life in a proactive manner and not in a reactive manner.
Though as
That's
we,
a major
as we
Jewish
said,
concern.
But as we said, unfortunately, many of these Jews discovered their Judaism, were forced into their
in
Judaism
times of tragedy.
in times of tragedy, and it's always like that.
It's always like that
So you
because-
need the trauma, unfortunately, you need the bad things to happen for Jews to wake up, or I don't know if that's the right term.
Well, first of all, the fact that people feel awakened in light of tragedy is not a Jewish issue. It's a human issue.
Mm-hmm.
You said something that I think is a subtle distinction from what I believe. You said we need the tragedy in order to foster I reject that with all my might. I say if we already faced a tragedy,
But
like
would the
we
state
did,
of, yeah, okay.
now we need to recalibrate our lens, say, okay, the tragedy has already happened. We now have a moment of Jewish awakening. And by the way, also in many cases, non-Jewish awakening around issues of Judaism, Zionism in Israel. How do we
Christian
now seize
Zionism?
that moment
Yeah.
and now re-target it in a meaningful educational trajectory? That's the question that I'm bothered with.
But so, I just want to counter that. So, the Holocaust was a major, and we saw it in Pew surveys for many, many years in the United States.
73%.
73%.
Yeah.
Of,
We believe that it's the most significant Jewish event in their lives.
right.
Yeah.
But as years went by, the Holocaust becomes less and less a part of your Jewish identity. I was born in America. My grandparents were all born in America, but my wife's family is very Holocaust, oriented from all sides. And her grandmother, who survived Auschwitz from the beginning to the end, because she's from Poland, was from Poland, taught her when she was like 5 or 6, she says, one day the Nazis are going to come for you and I'm going to teach you how to hide. Now, until October 7th, this was a joke between my wife and me. And she didn't really like me joking about it. But after October 7th, when you hear the exact same thing of children needing to hide in a closet or whatever, in a basement, so there's that. But would the state of Israel be established if the Holocaust, we don't know, right? But the Holocaust definitely geared something towards that.
These are exactly the kind of rhetoric that I refer to when I talk about a reactive identity rather than a proactive identity. There's a huge difference between asking, would Israel be established without the Holocaust, from a political realpolitik? That's one question. So the answer can be no, yeah, well, absolutely. And between the question, is the Holocaust the justification for the state of Israel? To which my answer is a resounding no. Israel's right to exist does not lie upon
would the
tragedy
Jews,
that happened to Jews.
But would the Jews go on a boat
That's a different,
to the Middle East?
Yeah, but that's a different question.
Less of them would.
But
Those
that's
had
a-
nothing to lose.
That's a
after.
different question.
Okay.
And I'll explain why. Again, from an educational perspective. If I build an identity that is contingent on tragedies, I'm actually sending a double message. I say, on the rhetorical level, I'm against anti-Semitism. On a practical level, I rely on it. And that's, for me, absurdity. Because if I come and I say, from an educational standpoint, I aim to foster an identity that is proactive rather than reactive, that sees the history of the Jewish people as a history of revival and not survival. It's a story of joy and not oi. If that's the
I
path,
like that.
if
I'm
that's
gonna use
the,
it.
By the way, that's from, you mentioned Rabbi Sachs. That's his
Okay.
language.
Joy and not oi.
Joy and not oi. And if that's the trajectory that I want to cultivate, that I need to invest in a pathway of identity that is utterly divorced from whether anti-Semites exist or don't exist. In other words, the formation of identity should be divorced from the presence of anti-Semites. And as long as it's not, that's what scares me the most. I surrender my own narrative as a people to the narrative of those who want to end my story rather than the story itself. And that's what concerns me.
So the state of Israel, as well as the Jewish people, are investing tens of billions of dollars in combating anti-Semitism. You mentioned one organization. There are many organizations out there. You keep on thinking that you know them all. And then the alphabet soup keeps on growing and growing and growing. And you find out that there's 2 AJCs and all the other things. So is all this money going to the garbage? Because you're talking about taking, let's say, you didn't talk about funds, but at the end of the day, time and resources into building a positive or a natural Jewish identity. But all this money is going to what you call reactive. Now, some of it kind of needs to be, because if you have a Jewish institution that needs guards, and you're not getting enough funding from the state or from your country, then you need it, right? And that's a lot of money. And we saw many synagogues in Copenhagen, etc., where there was a young man who was the community sent him to Israel to learn how to guard, and he was killed outside the synagogue there, I think in 2015. So when we spoke before, I told you that the New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, fun fact, said sometime in the past year, I think, that the ADL should close and all the money or resources should go to Jewish education. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, Bret Stephens' address sent ripples across both the Jewish and non-Jewish world, but those of us who are engaged with that world on an extensive level, Bret Stephens didn't say anything that I found to be of novelty. However, having said that, I don't necessarily agree with that dichotomy or binary way of thinking of let's close this and invest in this. I'm of the mind that the ADL does important work, definitely, like you mentioned, Zvika, bring it to the consciousness, to public discourse, and so on and so forth. However, I would say this. The tendency to be reactive by nature and invest so much from within the Jewish community's resources, mindset, and even educational institutions in fighting anti-Semitism is like, in many, many ways, extinguishing fires. And if you're only busy extinguishing fires all the time, you will end up with a scorched land. In other words, extinguishing fires is important as long as there is a concentrated effort, intentional, systematic, and strategic, to plant trees. And that's the role of education. And in that regard, two things to consider. Number one, anti-Semitism is not an onslaught on Jewish values. It's an onslaught on liberal, democratic, Western values. I always bring as an example George Washington's letter to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island from the late 18th century, where he promises to form a government that, quote, gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, end of quote. That letter features until to this day in the Tourist Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. Wow. In other words, when we look, the Jewish community's tendency to look at anti-Semitism as primarily a Jewish issue is shooting itself in its own foot. Therefore, anti-Semitism should start be looked at in many, many ways as an onslaught on the civil freedoms of people and not on their religious, ethnic, or racial freedoms. That's number one. Number two, and by the way, this conference shows it, Jews have many more allies than they sometimes often to identify. When your mindset is panic-driven,
and we're very panicked.
And we are very panic-driven.
Yes.
The way you scope the landscape is in search of enemies, not in search of allies. And my claim is that once you recalibrate that lens, you find that a lot of non-Jewish members within the academic setting, within the legislation, within social discourse, within your workplace, have absolutely nothing against Jews. Yet we don't cultivate those alliances because we are so busy extinguishing fires all the time. So it requires a paradigm shift. So to your answer, my friend, to your question, my friend, we don't need to stop fighting anti-Semites, but we need also to refocus our attention and resources to cultivate the alliances and friendships who understand that anti-Semitism, like you said, is the first bout of a much greater ailment in Western civilization, and will never end with the Jews alone.
So, for us here in Israel, the past 2.5 years is a blur. So sometime in the past 2.5 years, because, it's all one chunk, I did a short podcast series about Christian Zionism, which is something that I wasn't aware of up until then, and even the roots of evangelical Christianity in the Zionist movement at its first years in Europe, and one thing that kind of came up with every single one of them, whether it pastors or evangelical leaders, was, you know, you like we understand why the Jews haven't accepted us for so many years because of what happened, but at the same time, like we're reaching out, and we want that relationship, we want that connection, but still, I would say many Jews are very hesitant towards this type of a relationship. So this is one group, but I'm sure there are many others. Yeah. So like, who should we be reaching out to? You said academics, politicians. I don't know.
Academics. I don't.
Microphone.
I don't say no to anyone who is willing to listen to me, because I think that it's a generalization that can be very, very dangerous. We need to get out of this kind of shtetl mentality where we take care of business on our own. It doesn't work, definitely not in the 21st century, and it doesn't advance the Jewish cause in any way, nor the larger social cause. I think that if the Jewish community wishes to become fully integrated, and in bad times and good times, it needs to take a massive role in educating its surrounding that, one, it is an integral member of society. Look, in the Western world today, and I'm generalizing, if an African American is attacked or an African European is attacked, it is a social ailment. If someone from a Hispanic or Latino background is attacked, it's a social ailment. If someone from the LGBTQ plus community is, it's a social ailment. If someone with cognitive or physical disabilities, it's a social ailment. If a Jew is attacked, it's a Jewish problem. That needs to change. And in order to change that, the onus is first and foremost on the Jewish community to re-narrate itself to the non-Jewish surrounding around it. And my main claim is that we have far more open ears to that plea than we are willing to scope, because our mind are targeted towards the enemy and not towards the potential ally.
So so you mentioned these alliances, and still though, one issue I definitely see is, Israel has become either the reason or the excuse for anti-Semitism, for hate, for whatever you want to call it, and it's not. Israel is not, even if there's a new government tomorrow, won't be so different probably than what it is now on issues that have to do with security, and that have to do with fighting. And so how do you teach, I keep on saying kids, but people who are on Birthright or the younger generation, who are in universities, which are a more liberal or progressive institutions, to live with a situation where Israel is very different than what they believe in, but still, whether it combating, hate or combating ignorance, how do you bridge that gap?
The byword is already in your question, and that bridging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know this very well because you and I have talked extensively many, many times. Professor Len Sachs, my dear friend and colleague here from Brandeis University, knows this well, as he's deeply, deeply involved with Birthright Israel as well. We live in a world that demonstrates, in many, many cases, an opposite relationship between high access to information on the one hand and a much lower ability or desire to engage knowledge in depth. Mm-hmm. I call it a world of surfers without a diving license. And when people surf and don't dive, you find very, very quickly that there is a huge disparity between the multi-layered reality of Israel and the superficial perception of Israel. And the purpose of education, in this case Birthright Israel, for example, aims exactly to bridge that gap, introducing complexity, diversity, plurality of thought, showing that unity among Jews is utterly divorced from uniformity between Jews, and so on and so forth. That's number one. Number two is that we learn that in the digital age, especially with a explosion of data and information, with the very perception of truth, at the age of everyone can disseminate something, and then you need to sift through it. There's great suspicion of the very concept of truth. Experience on site becomes something that is virtually irreplaceable. You need to experience something in order to wrestle with its complexity. And third, and when we discussed this, I asked you a question. I said, every human being, for example, has certain types of food that they don't like. Certain dishes that they will never touch. Okay, there are people who will never touch meat, others will never touch fish, but whatever it is. Okay,
I don't have one of those.
you don't have one. Okay, let's say I don't like a particular type of dish. Okay, you won't see me tomorrow raising banners and say that I'm against the concept of food. What do I mean by that? You can have criticism against the government, against the policy, against. How do I identify, by the way, anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, as just yet another manifestation of an ancient, nothing new anti-Semitic rhetoric? When I see that the solution to the grievances is far, far more far-reaching than the grievances themselves. If you have a problem with one Israeli government or another, which, by the way, you can have with any government
Most
in
of
the
us
world.
do.
Okay,
Yeah.
most of us do, by the way. What does that have to do with the very legitimacy of Israel to exist? What does that have to do with it? You can say, I don't like the government. And by the way, one of the things that we teach on Birthright Israel, and it's part of our language, is that Israel was established as a state of ideals, not as an ideal state. Mm-hmm. Nobody claimed that Israel, wherever you have humans, there are problems. The USA doesn't have a few tiny skeletons in its own closet from the past 250 years.
It's a perfect
Any
place.
other country here that doesn't have skeletons in its own closet. So let's relax. The purpose of education is come and say, let's investigate what are those ideals and critically examine those. Unrealistic praise of Israel will result also with unrealistic criticism of Israel. Both need to be wrestled with, and we need to come to terms with the
I think that
complexity.
sentence is important, though, because when we spoke, I told you. So at the end of the day, you take people to the Kotel, you take them to the Western world, you take them to I don't know. Now I have a block in my head. To the Dead Sea, right? There are certain things you have to do on Birthright. So that's very positive, right? And so part of what your challenge is to not, in the past, if people are like, oh wow, Birthright Israel, wow, amazing, right? There was a whole an Israel Saturday Night Live, Eretz Nehederet. There was a whole skit years ago.
Years ago, yeah.
Years after I found out that Birthright actually helped them produce it before your time, I think. But anyways, it seemed very like superficial. Wow, everything's amazing here, and now your challenge is really, especially now, to actually show sides of Israel that, again, without getting into the interpretation, may be negative to the viewer.
Bring it on. By all means, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I said the distance between perception and reality. The perception of Birthright as a wow factor, let's go here, far from it, not even close. As a matter of fact, and I gave you that example, one of the things that Birthright Israel does is its introduction of the geopolitical module that deals with Israel, the complex reality of Israel in the Middle East. And what we do there is one of my main goals was also not only to tackle issues like conflict and multiple narratives and so forth. Birthright participants not only hear about the complexity of the region, they actually visit, for example, Jewish Arab venture initiatives that kind of challenge their preconceived assumption that in Israel, the formula Jew plus Arab always equals conflict.
Mm-hmm.
They will never be experiencing that through the digital media platforms. And when they go to certain sites and they meet a Jew and an Arab working together as co-CEOs of an ice cream factory that also gives money to schools and to this and shared society initiatives, all of a sudden they realize that this binary way of thinking, the either or, you're either that or you're either. The session before us here spoke about populism and anti-Semitism, and he was talking about this binary way of thinking. It's the people versus the elite. It's us versus them. It's white versus black. No, it's not. It's not. It's just not like that. So addressing this kind of complexity is definitely an important part. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you one more thing. One of the beauties of what we try to do is that we actually tell them, guys, the true complexity of Israel is measured by us exploring what I call the extraordinary power of ordinary life. Israel is not manifested in the Western Wall or in Masada or the Dead Sea. That's not where Israel comes to life. These are symbolic, powerful but symbolic sites. But if you really want to understand what's going on here, you have to engage
People to people.
people to people on a daily basis, the non-extraordinary elements of normal life.
Mm-hmm.
That's where life happens.
Right.
And that's part of education.
So one more maybe anecdote, and then we'll open it up for questions. You mentioned you know, the amount of information out there, and it's really huge. So one thing that we tackle in our newsroom is in the past, not so long ago, if there's a swastika spray painted or drawn somewhere, whatever, that was a news story. Fast forward until, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, it's changed, and we don't have the capacity to write about every swastika because that happens every day in multiple places. And also, unfortunately, you know, we're you know, media, you know, mass media is focused on clicks. So we see what people are interested in and what they're not interested in. And swastikas are not interesting anymore. That said, there are violent attacks against Jews. There are, you know, so many other things to do. I have 2 reporters covering anti-Semitism. I could have 10, and they would still have a lot to get to the next day. So it's really, it's a very worrying situation, because in the past, let's say, you know, during Trump's first term, a swastika in a Jewish cemetery in Ohio could be at the top of CNN and open Israeli news broadcasts. But now it's just normal. So how, you know, again, you're not in media, you're in education, but how, in your opinion, do we actually make sure that it doesn't become normal?
Precisely what I said before.
Okay,
First,
thank you. Okay.
First, stop looking at it as a Jewish problem. It's a Jewish issue. Stop appointing only Jews to take care of it on your behalf. Start finding those who are intelligent enough and have a robust ethical backbone to understand that this is a social ailment, that this is a civil issue, that it is threatening to social cohesion and not only to a minority's life. That's step number 1. Step number 2, again, I'm not saying to avert our eyes from the phenomenon. Zvika, you're absolutely right. I mean, all I'm saying is, let's remain focused on not being kidnapped by this, because if we are kidnapped into this kind of narrative, the results of the destruction of Jewish identity for generations to come are far greater than the damages of anti-Semitism in 2026. So absolutely, address this, but not at the expense of planting trees and doing the hard planting of identities in this run, because if we don't do that, we'll have a much greater problem on our hands in the next generation.
So just before I open up for questions, just to relate to one thing you said, do you think the special envoys, many, I think dozens of countries now have special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. You think it's more effective for the cause that these special envoys, ambassadors, whatever, will not be Jewish by default, or depending on the,
Again, not either or, both.
Okay.
So if Jews,
But not
just like this
as like a
conference,
cushy job for a Jew in the political party.
No,
Okay.
no, absolutely not. I think actually one of the reasons I was attracted to come here with you is exactly because this is a conference on anti-Semitism. If there were only Jews in this conference, I wouldn't have come. Not because it's not important, I just wouldn't have come. When I heard that
I only come when Zohar comes, so
when I heard this is actually an international conference with like-minded non-Jews who care about this issue, I said, oh, finally we are looking at this from a broader perspective, and we understand that just like I would sit on a conference about racism against black individuals because it's a social ailment, not a black issue, I expect my non-Jewish allies to sit with me on this issue, not because they're doing me a favor, but because they understand that this is a threat to human cohesion, to communal cohesion, to social cohesion, and your job in readdressing and recalibrating the context of this within your own respective academic environments, I believe is absolutely crucial.
Perfect, thank you. So Lily, we'll have you join us again. Open it up for questions. Since this is broadcasted on YouTube, so if you want to come up and we'll give you the microphone so the audience at home could hear it.
Yeah, please come.
So just maybe come to the stage because otherwise you won't be heard.
And if you can just tell us who you are and where you're from.
Thank you. I don't have a question, just I have a comment to add about you said. I'm Abdullah ibn Hissi from Morocco. I am not Jewish, as you said. Just I have something to say. I think combating anti-Semitism is it will be always a failure combat.
Yes.
In my perspective.
Yes.
I speak French more than English, so so I think to combat anti-Semitism, we must invest in the field of the media. People who attack synagogues, drawing swastika, etc., they didn't read some kind of academic books or attending those meetings. They just respond about what they saw, what they heard in the media. As a Moroccan, I think the battle will be in the field of the media. As a Moroccan, I saw my society being attacked all the days long with the propaganda from Al Jazeera and Al Arabi Al Jadid and also Turkish media, which always post documents, news in Moroccan dialect, because Moroccan society is a very unique society which must be studies how Moroccan Jewish and Muslim cohabit and coexistence for many centuries.
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing to work on it in the future is the media and to combat propaganda against this coexistence and this model of coexistence in Moroccan society and the MENA in general. Thank you again.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'll just add, I agree with you about Al Jazeera, etc. I think we have a very big issue that we have there's no alternative to all of these stations. I mean, maybe Sky News Arabia, but we don't really have anything that's combating that, and that's a real issue.
Hi, so my name is Debbie Kaminer. I am a law professor at a business school in New York City, and I have three interconnected questions.
Yes.
So my first question is, I agree with you 100% about allies.
Yes.
And just a question I had about that is, are there programs to bring over potential allies from the United States? And I was thinking about this because recently my daughter, who's been to Israel a dozen times, was packing to go on a birthright program. And her two best friends who are not Jewish were over.
Yeah.
And they were saying, why do you need to go on a free trip to Israel again? And she's explaining Jewish identity, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, you have a full Jewish identity. You've been to Israel a dozen times. If Israel wants allies, it should be hosting people like us to come, which I think is a valid point. That's the first question. My second question is, I also agree with you 100% about the danger of making anti-Semitism your whole identity.
Yes.
I think there are many people in the United States from my generation who actively decided we were not going to do that for our children, which worked great until October 7th. Now, there are October 8th Jews, but there are also many college students who are Jews, who have very strong Jewish identities, are very proud to be Jewish, are not in any way anti-Israel, but they don't feel a sense of visceral fear. They don't seem to understand at a gut level how dangerous anti-Semitism can be. So I wonder sometimes if we went too far in the opposite direction. And then my third question is that, how do you reach the American Jews who have become disconnected from Israel? Like with the Gen Zers, how many of them, it's not even that they're anti-Israel, the Jewish students, they've just become disconnected.
Right.
How do you reach those kinds of students and bring them in? So,
Well, these are all the three humongous questions, each and every one of them. With the first point that you raised, I'm sorry, what's your name?
my name is Debbie.
Debbie. With the first point that you raised, I think that you hit the nail on the head. I can tell you that I'm a very strong advocate of trying to think much more systematically about Israel experiential programs that bring Jews and non-Jews together to explore Israel. Of course, it has a lot of educational, namely content-wise ramifications, but that's a technicality as far as I'm concerned. That's not the issue. And the reason, I'll take even your point one step further. I think that the number one, in my opinion, the number one threat or challenge, not threat, challenge, that many young Jewish students face today across campuses in the Western Hemisphere is not lack of content, lack of knowledge, rather it's just loneliness when it comes to their identity as Jews and their associations with Israel and Zionism. And I think that if programs that engage Israel invite Jews and non-Jews together, and then they go back to their campuses, the Jew, not only the non-Jew, the Jew also looks at it and says, wow, my Israel experience is no longer scoped from within the myopic realms of my identity as a Jew, but also as part of a bigger communal conversation. And it will add a level of not just safety from anti-Semitism, but self-assured identity in a proactive way. So absolutely, you're absolutely correct. I'm completely committed to that concept. Again, I'm not talking now from my head as Birthright Israel. I'm talking as an educator. As some
There
things
are
like that.
smaller initiatives.
There are smaller initiatives like Passages that brings
Evangelicals.
Christian students, but a combination needs to happen on. There is iTrack that brings Jews and non-Jews, but those are definitely not on the scale of Birthright
Or
Israel.
like heads of,
and-
they're like student leaders.
Yeah, and it needs to happen. It needs to happen.
But it's like very boutique, not popular.
Yeah.
Lily, you want to maybe just, before we get to your question, regarding the Gen Z and how to connect them? Because
It's going to be really hard. I'm going to be really honest, and it's a very depressing answer, but especially if they're in like these, the more extreme they are, regardless of right or left, like the less moderate they are, the harder it's going to be to try to even have conversations. You see with the rise on, at least in the United States, with like on the right, you have the Nick Fuentes, the Tucker Carlson, I was about to say Catarlson.
You can say
and
it.
then and then you have on the left, you have like it's different types of anti-Semitism, but it's very similar. You have the Ilhan Omars and soon to be
Mamdani.
Mamdani and I forget her name, but the most recent.
AOC?
No, she was in the primaries in New York, who was against interracial relationships. I forget her name. But both sides, even though they have different views regarding other social issues like the LGBTQ community, systemic racism in the United States, they all agree that like Israel is the most evilest thing, and they're also getting funding in a lot of similar places. They're getting that Qatari money, the Russian money, Iranian money, even money from the CCP. I think the first goal, not even like first goal is, I think, education, and you have to de-radicalize. I think that's going to be a very important thing for Gen Z and maybe even Gen Alpha, is like de-radicalize, being like, okay, you can't say from the river to the sea. Israel is a place that exists. You have to deal with it, and then you can move forward with like other history. And even, I think it would be, what I've been experiencing is you have like little fun facts being like, Marilyn Monroe converted to Judaism in 1956. Did you know that Egypt banned her films because of that in 1956? Like, you lead in with like little bite-sized snacks of like information. It's going to be really, really difficult to de-radicalize my generation. But
So I'll just say for our live stream, you asked about the disconnected students, not those who are already convinced that we're, the worst thing in the universe.
I think that is very much the silent majority, and the reason they're silent is because everyone else is already speaking. So if we get the conversations steered away from Israel is a terrorist, racist, genocidal state and more towards like normalization, then I think there'll be less of a disconnect, because that silent majority will like warm up to being more open about talking about Israel as a country, not even just with regards to the conflict being something like the Abraham Accords or like other peace relations. So
Okay.
I'll add one more word to that, and Len can attest to that. Len is our just disclaimer, Professor Len Sachs from Brandeis University. He's our lead researcher. He's been the lead researcher of Birthright Israel since its inception in 2000. And a few things, and maybe Len can attest to that. We found in our research that he conducted that actually when we analyzed results of Birthright Israel's impact, we realized that actually those who identified as progressive and leaning towards certain ideas who came on Birthright came out of it affected by Birthright to no less extent than those who came with a much more, let's say, again, favorable or predisposition towards Israel. As for the disconnected, we know that at the end of the day, it's not marketing, it's not the banners, it's not the slogans, ear to mouth. When a participant hears from a friend of theirs, listen, I went there, it's not what you think, it's far more complex, I'm not dealing with what you think, but Birthright Israel aims to shape how you think about things, not what you think about them. Go and get the experience, that will be the main effect. And the more we able to bring those who are less connected, through them we can get those who are even less connected, and it's a process. Len.
Yeah, Len.
So I'm going to ask a question that will be a foil for Zohar to educate us. He's an amazing educator, as I hope you realize. At one point in time, I was puzzled by how could Birthright actually make a difference when I believe, as Zohar articulated it, that you need to educate everybody, and that you can't isolate Jews. But I came to realize that in sociology it's called the social capital formulation. And when Birthright began, Bowling Alone had just been published, and the idea of bonding social capital, which was the virtual definition of Birthright and its mission, was being dissed and in favor of bridging social capital, learning how to engage with others. And what I realized, and this is the build up to getting Zohar to talk some more about the educational philosophy of Birthright, is that bonding social capital, learning how to connect with people who you share something with, is actually the foundation for bridging social capital. You got to know yourself. You learn that through your intimate family relationships, and that allows you to do other things. One thing that hasn't been talked about much here is the mifgash, the encounter between the diaspora young adults and their Israeli, at least chronological peers. It continues to be at the core of operationally how the program has the impact that it does. And again, one of the things that I've realized is that actually what happens is that people come together, the Yisraelim and the diasporans, and they think that they are different, and then they figure out that they have this thing called their Jewish identity that's in common, and I believe that that's what's teaching them. And so I'd like to push you a little bit, Zohar, to talk more about, if you will, resolving this conflict between, again, the universal and the particular.
I'll take Len's question. Len refers to the component, as he mentioned, called mifgash. It's the translation of the word is encounter, where we bring together worldwide Jews with their Israeli peers. And the Israeli peers, it's important to note, do not join the program as Santa's little helpers, as they were, people who will teach them about it. Actually, they join as participants, 100% participants who came to learn.
And most of the time they're soldiers, which is also
And
interesting.
in most cases, because of the chronological age, many of them fall into their army service years. And here, what Len was referring to, in my philosophy, falls under a broader canopy of reintroducing the value of dialogue in a world that seems to be obsessed with parallel monologues. One of the greatest challenges that we face today in Western society, and by the way, to my Moroccan esteemed colleague, I think that what you said about media is precisely that, where it exploits a channel of a particular monologue based on an echo chamber and then just advocates in that line and not allowing a voice of dissent into the conversation. When we want to cultivate dialogue, not just between Israelis and Americans or Israelis and French, but between Americans and American Jews and Israelis and both, between people, there's something that I find very intriguing. If you look at people's opinions about things, and then you say there are some to the left and some are to the right, we think about it, when we think about opinions, definitely when it galvanized by political mindset, we think in a very linear fashion. If I say left versus right, you think about it in a linear way. And the more radical one is to the left, and the more radical one is to the right, the further away they are from one another. It's in a linear fashion. But actually, and that's to the point that Len made, if we dig a little deeper, and before we resort to the opinions or to ideas, we try to, first of all, unpack what is the foundational value system which brings those people together as a people, be it Jewish, be it universal values, be it values compared to homeland, to family, to safety, to security. You find something quite compelling. Many a time, people from the left or the right share very similar values. And when you focus on that first, and that's what we do on Birthright, we say, let's not deal with our disagreements. Let's first of all agree to agree on a platform of values, of shared values, upon which we can now brush convergent ideas against each other without threatening the communal cohesion of a group. We call it unity without uniformity. You and I don't need to agree on everything in order to feel that there is something that we have in common that is at the base of that foundation. And that requires a very specific pedagogy, and Len, you know this very well. We work very hard with our staff to establish the tools and the talent for our staff to be able to extract that kind of value-driven discussion before we go into what do you think about Israel, what do you think about Zionism, what do you think about this, and what do you think about that?
I have a perfect example. So one of the groups I met, one of the Israelis said, we assumed that all the Israeli soldiers on the bus said, we assumed that all the American Jews who would come would be BDS supporters, because that's what we see on TV, right, encampments or whatever. So we assumed that all like young Jews in America are anti-Israel, and would like we would have to convince them that like what's happening here post October 7th is important for our survival, and like, but the Americans were already convinced. And there was an interesting situation where they were telling me that the same day I met them in the evening, they were on the Gaza border, and there was a helicopter that bombed some building in Gaza, and they saw it from the border, and it collapsed. The building collapsed, and some of the Israelis were like clapping hands. And one of the Americans from the West Coast said, I felt very uneasy with you doing that, and the Israeli who did such had a really good answer. He said, I understand why you would think that, but like, you have to understand that I have friends who are there now physically. Like, I know they're there. And if this protects them, then for me, I'm not celebrating, death. I'm not celebrating destruction, but for me, it's existential, and it was a beautiful conversation, which ended very well. It could have blown up, just like the building, but it didn't. And I think it was a really interesting connection.
And by the way, it's interesting what you said now. As an educator, for me, the institution of a dialogue is not contingent on agreement or consensus. No. Far from it. A dialogue is a self-standing value. It's not a means to a higher end, but rather an end in and of itself. The purpose of dialogue is not persuasion or dissuasion. Its main purpose is familiarity. Get to know who stands in front of you. Get to know them as a human being before you get on their throat because of their opinion. Be it to the left or the right, that's none of my business. Okay, so there's a lot of reconstruction that needs to happen on our side, on your end, on the way we reshape a language, in this case around anti-Semitism. But by the way, I'm not talking about shaping a language around anti-Semitism. I'm talking about reshaping a language around social cohesion and sense of unity. It is true in Morocco concerning a host of other issues. It is true in Belgium concerning a host. It has nothing to do endemically with anti-Semitism. It has to do with the human condition and our approach to social ailments and how do we want to address them effectively.
$5:30. So 5:30. 5:30, we'll go to the auditorium. So, perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so we have time for, let's say, 3 more questions. We'll get them one after another, and then, yeah. So, yeah, I think you have to come, though.
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah.
Yariv Lapid. I work as an educator for many years, and I'm very impressed by what you described, but I'm stuck on a point that I think Zvika was trying to push you to.
Yes.
It's about the reactive and proactive concept. And you were stressing, if I understood you correctly, that there is a tendency among us as Jews to be sucked into the conversation about the horrific things that happen to us. And you said it's unhealthy to build an identity on these negative issues, which I totally agree with. I heard you take that very much to the side of not looking so much at the horrible things that happen to us. But I do think that's a bit difficult. Because
Just to clarify, I never said, that's not what I said. So
I want to
let's
understand it
clarify.
better.
Yeah, please,
Let me
go
just
ahead. Yeah.
clarify a little bit
Yeah.
what I mean.
Yeah.
Because I do think that there is something about the Jewish history that is a little bit different than most other nations.
Okay.
And also the history of Israel
Yes.
is, to this day, different from most of the other. We usually identify with Western democracies, but we're very different from almost all other democracies, if not all of them.
I agree.
So, and I think a lot of what you said was very much putting us on the universal side, as trying to see us as other normal nations, as not something that is unique, which I do think we should go much more in that direction, but it's not so easy because the power of our uniqueness is so difficult that it's dealing with that uniqueness that is such a challenge, especially in programs like Taglit. And that's why I found Zvika's questions at times trying to say, but what do you do with this very baffling situation of this hatred of what happens after October 7th, of the Holocaust? I'm a Holocaust educator. I have a very hard time understanding the Holocaust. I've been trying to deal with it for many years,
Yeah.
and there are so many deep questions
Yeah.
I find very, very difficult to struggle with. And so it's these darker parts of the Jewish identity of this day that I wonder how you actually deal with without going to this universal, we're like everyone else.
Okay, so thank you for your
So
question.
I'm just going to take the 2 other questions.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And
So you want
remember that. Remember it.
big
Okay. It's okay.
questions.
Hi, I worked at Columbia University and I was there during 10/7 and became active working with faculty, students, and staff. And it was clear that the student leaders were those who had a very strong connection to Israel.
Yeah.
Many of them were on the Birthright program. So thank you for this program. And I would like to know more about the curriculum. You kept referring to it because it sounds like an ideal curriculum that's needed by the universities to improve their ideological diversity, to create those conversations. It sounds like you already have this curriculum that they need, and they go to other organizations that don't have the substance that you have. So could you tell us more about it?
Okay, and then just the last question. You want to? No? Okay.
Okay, and I think that
Okay.
those two humongous. Yaniv, that's Yariv, slicha. To Yariv's
Yariv
question.
Lapid, very
Yariv
similar to
Lapid, that's,
Yair Lapid,
yeah,
but not.
And Yariv
No, I
Lapid.
mean the name. That's it.
A good MK's name. To Yariv's question, which requires further elaboration on my part. So I want to be very, very clear on this. When I'm talking about the Jewish story, as it were, I make a distinction between events that happened to Jews and events that happened by Jews. Not all. Now, I don't want you to think about it in a binary way. Not all events that happened to Jews are bad, nor are all events propagated by Jews are good. However, the distinction remains. For example, the destruction of the Second Temple is an event that happened to Jews. Chanukah is an event that happened by Jews. The Holocaust, the same way. I try to make a distinction between what I call historical events and civilizational events. My main claim is that the Jewish narrative has for hundreds of years focused on the negative historical events without counter it, not dismissing, God forbid, I never said that. It's crucially important to remember those events for sure, and not only to commemorate them, to cherish them, to honor them. Part of the reason I'm so proud to be Jewish is because Judaism has turned memory into an art form. And that's a major achievement from a civilizational perspective for me. However, my main claim is that when you train a people to focus only on those negative events that happen to Jews, they will eventually succeed in becoming the featured blocks of your identity. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm always saying learning and studying the Holocaust is of existential importance. There's no question there. But I'm not a Jew because of the Holocaust. I'm a Jew despite the Holocaust. I would have remained a Jew even if the Holocaust never happened. The same thing I say about October 7th. I was a Jew on October 6th, and I remained a Jew on October 8th. I'm not an October 7th Jew. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about proactive identity versus reactive. That's all I'm saying. And it requires a paradigm shift.
And now just in short, relate to the curriculum.
And as far as the curriculum goes, here, while I understand your question, and I can respond to it in a technical manner, I want to point a foundational caveat on what you said. Because Birthright Israel is not just the curriculum. It's the state of Israel, the country itself, as what I call a corresponding environment. In other words, if I only extracted the curriculum from the experience and gave it to you,
it would be boring. It wouldn't be.
I would give you something that is not only artificial, but could be even a subserving, because it will be divorced from the landscape within it was designed to correspond. That is not to say that curriculum in Hillel's and Mayanot and Chabad houses and other forms needs to be for sure, but I'm not positive that it should be taken from cut and paste from Birthright, because what we are very successful at doing is doing what I call not a sightseeing trip, but an insight-seeing journey that is built through the organic experience of Israel itself.
I think it's also kind of similar to the experience or things you learn in summer camp and what you learn in Jewish day school or whatever, other day schools. The experience is a lot more, it's part of your, I had a Birthright participant in one of my groups who a few years later, we used to have Google Groups, if anybody remembers those. You definitely don't know what Google Groups are. And for our group, for our bus, and he said, I was in a meeting or I went somewhere, and I kept on smelling this smell of something burnt. And I didn't understand what it was. And then he looks down and he says, I haven't worn these shoes since my visit in Israel. And it was at the Bedouin tent and what's it called? Mamshit. I don't know if you go there anymore. And there was a bonfire. And and fire, doesn't go away, like the smell, the smoke. And he said, and that's... The shoes absorbed. He hasn't worn those shoes since, and he's like, I just thought of all of you and our experience. Like you can't put that on a piece of paper, right? So first of all, thank you to Lily and to Zohar. At the beginning, I was like, wait, Zohar, what are we going to talk about for an hour and a half? And then I was like, I could speak to Zohar for 5 hours, and it would always be interesting. And thank you for sharing your experiences into Gen Z. Which is something I experience at work, which is very interesting. It's a whole different panel, but I want to be sensitive of your time. So thank you, everybody, and have a successful conference.